At some point after 40, certain people just stop talking as much. They stop calling back as fast, stop showing up to things they used to love, and they stop explaining themselves to people who didn't listen the first time anyway. From the outside, this looks cold, like they've changed, like something went wrong, like they're angry at the world or shutting down. But a 19th century philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche had a completely different reading of this behavior, and what he said might be the most honest explanation of it anyone has ever put into words. He believed this kind of silence wasn't weakness, and it wasn't depression, and it wasn't a personality malfunction. He thought it was one of the purest signs of strength a person could demonstrate, that it was, in fact, a sign that a person was finally becoming who they actually were. And modern psychology doesn't just tolerate that view, it actually backs it up with specific, measurable research findings. In this video, we're going to walk through exactly why people go quiet after 40, what the psychology behind it really says, how Nietzsche's philosophy fits the picture in a way that will probably surprise you, and how to tell the difference between someone who is choosing silence and someone who is drowning in it. Here's the first thing you need to understand. This quietness almost never comes from one single moment. It doesn't happen because of one bad conversation, one toxic friendship, or one disappointing relationship. It builds slowly, invisibly, over years, and then one day the person just stops pretending that the social cost isn't real. By the time someone reaches their 40s, they are usually carrying a compressed set of roles that didn't exist simultaneously in their 20s. They might be working full-time, raising children, worrying about aging parents, managing their long-term health, carrying financial pressure from mortgages and responsibilities, and dealing with the accumulated weight of past betrayals, broken promises, and friendships that turned out to be one-directional. All of that together leaves very little room for socializing that doesn't feel worth it. And so the first things that get cut are the obvious ones. The parties attended purely out of obligation, the group chats that drain energy without returning anything, the conversations that circle the same topics and never go anywhere real. Psychologists who study how people change across a lifespan have a specific name for this pattern. It is called socio-emotional selectivity theory, and the core of it is this. As people get older and start to feel more acutely that time is finite, they stop chasing breadth and start chasing depth. A 22-year-old builds social surface area. They say yes to new things, they meet new people, they stay out late, they try to be everywhere. A 43-year-old starts asking whether the social investment is returning anything real. They would rather have 3 relationships that are honest, durable, and reciprocal than 30 relationships that feel like performing in a theater. That shift changes how much they talk, how much they share publicly, who they allow past a certain threshold, and how much patience they have for anything that feels performative. Now, here's something that matters a lot for understanding how this plays out in real life. To the people around them, this change almost always looks like it happened overnight. One year, your friend is texting you constantly, and then over the next 6 months, they become harder to reach, and something seems different, and you can't identify what changed. But the truth is, that person has usually been tracking the same patterns quietly for a very long time. They noticed, over many years, who only called when they needed something, and who showed up when things were genuinely hard. They noticed which conversations left them feeling lighter and more like themselves, and which ones left them emptied out and vaguely irritated for no specific reason. They spent years carrying more emotional labor than the people around them ever noticed, mediating conflict, holding secrets, absorbing stress, being the dependable one while rarely having that dependability returned. They kept more promises than were kept for them, stayed longer in rooms that weren't good for them, and extended goodwill long past the point where it was being met with anything equivalent. What looks like a sudden personality change from the outside is almost always the delayed, visible expression of years of quiet, internal calculation. The withdrawal had already been happening on the inside. The quietness is just the first time it became visible. There's also a perception problem layered on top of this that makes the change look more dramatic than it is. In your 20s, sociability is treated as the natural and admirable default. If you're quiet or reserved, people ask if you're okay. They try to draw you out. They treat the silence as something needing correction. But by midlife, many people have simply lost the energy and the motivation to perform warmth for people they don't actually feel connected to. They're not colder, they've just stopped the social theater that younger life demanded. And once you no longer need broad approval for the things that once required it, for attracting a partner, for building a professional reputation, for establishing an identity in a new environment, that theater stops feeling necessary. This is where Nietzsche becomes genuinely useful, and it's worth being precise about what he actually believed, because he's often quoted in ways that distort him. Nietzsche was a German philosopher who lived through the second half of the 19th century, and he wrote extensively about what he called the herd, by which he meant the crowd, the mass of people who live by rules they've absorbed from their culture without ever examining them. He believed that most people spend their lives being moved around by other people's opinions, other people's values, and other people's definitions of success, and that this kind of social contagion makes genuine self-development nearly impossible. The person who wants to grow, really grow, not just accumulate achievements, needs intervals of distance from that noise. In his writing, solitude was not loneliness. It was not punishment, and it was not retreat. It was a workshop, a protected space where a person could build themselves without the constant pressure of the crowd pulling their attention outward. He wrote about how constant social exposure creates a kind of slow contamination. You start thinking what everyone around you thinks, valuing what your social group values, performing the personality that gets approval, rather than inhabiting the one that's actually yours. So for Nietzsche, pulling back from people, going quieter, becoming harder to reach, refusing to explain yourself constantly, wasn't a failure of connection. It was an act of protection for something that required quiet to grow. But here's the most important distinction Nietzsche made, and it's the thing that separates his philosophy from simple antisocial coldness. He was very specific that he only respected silence that came from strength, not from wounds. He called one version noble solitude, the person who chooses distance because they have built enough inner order that they genuinely no longer need constant social validation. They're not performing independence. They've actually arrived at it. He called the other version wounded withdrawal, the person who goes silent because they are exhausted, bitter, or secretly hungry for the recognition they're pretending not to want. Nietzsche had no admiration for that second version whatsoever. He was especially suspicious of something he called ressentiment, which is resentment dressed up to look like strength or wisdom. The person who withdraws after 40 while secretly tracking whether anyone has noticed, while waiting for the people they've distanced themselves from to come after them, while constructing an internal narrative about how superior they are to the shallow people they've left behind. That is ressentiment, not strength. Real strength, in Nietzsche's framing, meant genuinely needing less, fewer explanations, fewer reassurances, fewer performances. Not faking the need for less while quietly demanding more. Now let's get practical because the psychological research behind midlife quietness traces back to specific, identifiable triggers, not just a vague sense of maturity. One of the most consistent triggers is what researchers call time scarcity. The daily arithmetic of adult life simply changes after 40. When you add up paid work, commuting, parenting, health maintenance, caregiving for aging parents or family members, household management, and even basic sleep and recovery, there's genuinely less time left over for social activity. And the social activity that gets cut first is always the lowest return kind. The obligations kept for social smoothness rather than genuine connection. A second very common trigger is boundary fatigue. People who spent their 20s and 30s being reliably available, the friend who always showed up, the colleague who always helped, the family member who always absorbed the crisis, often discover a frustrating reality. Consistent availability doesn't generate deeper appreciation, it generates higher expectations. The more available you are, the more people expect from you, not because they're malicious, but because availability normalizes a level of access. After enough rounds of this pattern, people stop making themselves so accessible, not out of anger or calculated revenge, but simply out of self-preservation. A third trigger is the confrontation with mortality. Not as an abstract concept, but as a felt reality. By your 40s, most people have lost a parent, a close friend, a peer, or someone they grew up alongside. When death becomes something you've actually felt, and not just intellectually understood, small talk starts to feel thinner in a way that's hard to fully explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. The contrast between conversations that carry real weight and conversations that fill time becomes almost impossible to ignore. There is also a process called post-disillusionment selectivity, which sounds academic but describes something most people will recognize instantly. After you've been through a painful divorce, a workplace betrayal where you trusted the wrong person, a friendship that completely collapsed under the first real pressure it faced, or a family conflict that revealed something you couldn't unknow, you stop extending trust as a default. You start making people demonstrate, over time, that they're actually reliable before you let them into the closer rings of your attention and energy. That's not bitterness, it's pattern recognition, and it's one of the more adaptive things a person can do. And finally, there is the digital dimension, which is entirely new to this generation of midlife adults. When every messaging platform maintains a constant expectation of immediate response, going quieter becomes far more visible and interpretable than it would have been in any previous era. In earlier decades, becoming more private could happen gradually without anyone treating the silence as a statement. Today, leaving a message on read for a day, stepping back from a group chat, or posting less on social media is often read as rejection, conflict, or emotional shutdown. The quietness gets interpreted through the lens of digital culture in a way that amplifies it enormously. Now, here's the section that matters most practically, because not all silence is the same, and treating it as though it is would be a serious mistake. Healthy midlife quietness has a specific structure that you can actually observe from the outside. The person still keeps their commitments and shows up for the people they've genuinely prioritized. They still laugh at the right moments, still have warmth for the small number of people they've chosen to keep close. Their words become fewer but more precise. When they do speak, there's more weight to it, more intentionality. They decline invitations without creating drama around it. They leave arguments without needing the last word. They stop treating explanation as a moral duty. They don't feel compelled to justify themselves to everyone who asks. Their boundaries become cleaner and more consistent rather than erratic. They make decisions about how to use their time with more calm rather than less. They redirect their energy toward things that feel durable: family, creative work, physical health, a faith or philosophical practice, a small number of friendships that have survived real tests. In Nietzsche's terms, this is what self-command looks like. Not coldness, but an ordered inner life that no longer leaks itself out into every available channel. The dangerous version of midlife quietness looks different, and the distinction is important enough that it shouldn't be glossed over. If the quietness arrives with a genuine loss of the ability to feel pleasure, if the person has stopped finding enjoyment in anything they once cared about, that's a warning sign. If it comes with chronic insomnia, significant changes in eating, a withdrawal from even the people they've always trusted, or an increase in self-medication through alcohol or other substances, those are not signs of Nietzschean self-mastery. That's depression, or burnout, or unprocessed grief, and it calls for a completely different kind of response than admiration. There is also a third version that gets confused with strength: silence used as a control mechanism. Some people go quiet not to protect themselves, but to generate anxiety in others, to make people chase them, to punish someone through absence, to avoid accountability by simply not engaging. That is not noble solitude in any meaningful sense. Knowing which version you're looking at, whether it's your own silence or someone else's, requires an honesty that is not always comfortable, especially when the answer isn't the one you're hoping for. There's one more idea from Nietzsche that fits this conversation almost perfectly, and it may be the most practically useful one of all. He wrote extensively about a concept he called self-overcoming, the idea that genuine development requires shedding earlier versions of yourself, even ones that were useful once. Midlife is the specific life stage where this process tends to happen most visibly. Many people arrive at their 40s carrying identities they built for other people's benefit without fully realizing they were doing it. The rescuer who makes every crisis their responsibility. The person who always says yes because saying no feels dangerous. The professional who has fused their entire sense of worth with their output at work. The family mediator who has spent 20 years smoothing everyone else's conflicts while their own needs went unanswered. These identities were built because they worked. They earned approval, love, security, professional success, or social belonging at some point. But by midlife, many people begin to feel the growing gap between who they perform and who they actually are, and maintaining that gap becomes exhausting in a way that younger life could absorb, but older life cannot. The quietness that comes at that crossroads is often the first external sign that the old identity is being taken apart. The silence isn't rejection of people, it's renovation of self. The person is disassembling a structure that no longer fits, which is an inherently internal and quiet process. Nietzsche would see this not as retreat, but as one of the most important things a person can do, because the ability to sit with yourself without performing, without needing validation, without constantly broadcasting your inner weather to the people around you, that capacity is what makes genuine growth possible rather than just the performance of it. Research on adult development adds one more layer that challenges a common assumption worth addressing directly. Most people treat social network size as a straightforward measure of health. Bigger is better. More connections equals more support. More people equals more happiness. But the data from longitudinal studies on adult well-being actually tells a more complicated story. Smaller social networks in midlife and later adulthood can be emotionally richer, not poorer. if they contain what actually matters, which is trust, honest communication, shared history, and reciprocal care. 5 people who will tell you the truth when you need to hear it and who show up during an actual crisis do significantly more for psychological well-being than 50 acquaintances who like your posts and disappear when things get hard. This is partly why many midlife adults change their conversation style in ways that look like withdrawal but are actually a shift towards something more real. They become less interested in self-presentation, in talking about themselves in ways designed to manage impressions, and more interested in candor, in saying the harder, truer thing. That shift reduces the volume of speech while increasing its weight and its utility. For people who grew up in unstable or emotionally unpredictable homes, this quietness of later life often carries an additional specific meaning. For the first time in their lives, they are safe enough to be quiet. They no longer need to monitor everyone around them, manage other people's emotions, perform warmth to prevent conflict, or make themselves hyper-available as a protective strategy. The silence isn't withdrawal from the world. For some people, it's the first real arrival into themselves. Let's put all of this into a single clear timeline, because it helps make the whole pattern more legible. In your 20s, the dominant move is expansion, saying yes, building social surface area, experimenting, proving yourself, meeting people, collecting experiences, discovering what you want by trying everything. In your 30s, roles accumulate faster than time does. Work responsibilities deepen, relationships become more serious, financial obligations increase, and for the first time you start doing real pattern recognition about who in your circle actually shows up and who doesn't. Around 40 and beyond, the contraction begins, deliberately, and, for most people, gradually. Fewer people, cleaner commitments, less explaining, less tolerance for conversations that drain without returning anything, more investment in what might actually last, health, family, craft, a few durable relationships. In later midlife, one of 2 futures tends to emerge. Either the quiet becomes integrated. The person becomes genuinely grounded, present and warm with the people who matter, capable of saying no without guilt and yes without resentment. Or the quiet hardens into alienation, where unresolved bitterness and accumulated disappointment lock the person out of any genuine connection. The difference between those 2 paths isn't always obvious in the short term, but over years it becomes unmistakable, and it is essentially permanent. Nietzsche's philosophical framing is only useful, only accurate, when the person is moving toward integration. When someone moves toward alienation, what looks from the outside like Nietzschean distance is actually something much more painful and much less chosen. So here's where this leaves us, and it's worth sitting with. If you've watched someone go quieter after 40, a parent, a friend, a partner, a colleague, the silence itself doesn't give you the full picture. The question that matters isn't whether they're speaking less, it's why they're speaking less and what's underneath the quiet. Are they pruning because they've learned something real about what costs too much? Becoming more themselves, more selective, more honest about where they put their time and energy? Or are they disappearing from life in a way that's costing them something essential, connection, meaning, health, joy? Nietzsche would say only one of those is strength, and after reading through all the psychology and all the philosophy, I think he'd be right about that. If this video opened something up for you, if you thought of a specific person or a specific season in your own life, there's a follow-up video that goes deeper into how emotional detachment actually operates inside long-term relationships and what it usually signals when someone you love goes quiet over time. That video is linked right now at the end of this screen, and it builds directly on what we've covered today.